Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started here fairly quickly. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself in the comment section below, I'd love to see who's joining in on the introduction to permaculture, where you're coming from, and one thing you hope to get out of today's session. Hey, Walt, nice to have you on board. Coming in from California, that's great. So there's 17 of you guys watching right now. Feel free to introduce yourself, let us know where you're coming from, and one thing that you hope to get out of today's course. Upstate New York, great. Portland, Oregon. Veda and my son Matt from Vermilion, awesome. Embrace every day, I'm from Alberta. Great, guys, awesome to have you guys on board. We'll get started here in a couple of minutes. If I'm looking to the right, I'm just trying to keep track of the comments here, so that's why I'm not looking straight at you. Simply Generosity, hey all, from Timmins, Ontario. I think that's probably Jen. Nice to have you, Jen. Hey, Ashley. Chris Bullock here from Cranbrook, BC. Looking forward to learning. Hi from Melbourne, Australia. Hey, Australia. Edmonton, Alberta. Great to have you guys. All right. Welcome to the introduction to permaculture. We're going to start with a session this evening that's going to last about an hour. And I will try and keep an eye on the comments on the right-hand side. Feel free to comment to each other and chat through the YouTube chat portal. That'd be great. And towards the end of the session, I'm going to leave about 30 minutes at the end that you can ask me any question you want through the chat window, and I'll do my best to answer it. We've got access to a whiteboard, and I can also just flap my arms around, and hopefully that'll make some sense for you guys. All right. So let me just share my screen here, and then we will get going. All right, so in this class, we're going to go through my typical Verge Permaculture Introduction to Permaculture course. And it typically takes me about 6 hours to teach, but because we're doing it live, it's actually going to take a little bit longer. And so we're going to break this up into smaller components so that you guys can make sure you have lots of time to absorb it. We're going to meet back at the YouTube channel every Wednesday evening at 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time and go through the entire program. So let's get into it. So first off, let me introduce myself. My name is Rob Avis, and I'm definitely not a one-man show. My wife and I run Verge Permaculture and have been for close to 10 years now. Both of us are mechanical engineers. We originally started off in the oil and gas industry, and actually previous to that, I grew up in a cake factory. I'm actually Charlie in the chocolate factory. And I know I don't look too big, but we had a 40,000 square foot cheesecake facility growing up, big enough to produce 100,000 cheesecakes a day. And the reason I'm telling you that is that I'm actually originally from industrial food. I got my mechanical engineering degree, and then I went off into industrial energy. And so I cut my teeth as an engineer, basically building gas and oil pipelines, and attained my professional designation. And I can remember the very day working in the oil and gas industry when I decided I had to quit. I was very aware of peak oil. I was aware of some of the food security issues, but not a lot of them. And I started getting really worried about what I was doing for a career. And so I didn't really know what to do about it. I started watching a lot of movies on peak oil specifically. I went to the University of Calgary and I participated in a architecture course specifically around ecological design. And I remember being in the office one day and getting Jeff Lawton's video, Greening the Desert. It's a very short video. I recommend you watch it if you haven't. And while I was watching this video of this guy turning this seemingly meaningless piece of desert into a productive food forest, I recognized at that point that I had to do something different with my life. it's not that I hated the oil and gas industry and that I needed to move away from it. In fact, I actually really enjoyed my job. It was challenging. It paid really well. I got to do a lot of travel. And so there are a lot of great things about it. However, being an engineer, I took out my calculator and I calculated out how many hours of life energy I actually have on this planet. And it turns out that the average male lives around 600,000 hours. And I'd burned through about a third of them working in an industrial cheesecake factory and now in the industrial energy industry. And I recognized that continuing down this path would mean status quo, basically that I would continue to perpetuate humanity in the same way that it's currently going right now. Now, I'm only one individual, and so I don't have any, great ambitions for being the one that will completely change the course of humanity. However, I did want to feel like I was doing my part. And so seeing this 3-minute video called Greening the Desert on YouTube, which you can still watch, I realized that I had to leave my job. And so I called my wife, who was working at another oil and gas company, and I said, we're going traveling. In fact, we're going to go around the world and we're going to try and find solutions, because all we're coming up against when we're here in Calgary are the problems that we're facing. And very few people are willing to have a conversation about the solutions. And so we need to go to places where the solutions are already being implemented, or at least people are talking about them. So being energy engineers, we went off to Denmark. We spent 6 months studying renewable energy at the Renewable Energy Institute called the Folk Center in northern Denmark. And what we recognized while we were there was that while everybody in Calgary was talking about how we couldn't change over to a new energy paradigm, in Denmark, they were already doing it. You see, in the 1970s, they had a choice between going nuclear or inventing a technology that had never existed before, wind turbines. And the reason the 1970s is an important time frame is that that's when the embargo, the oil embargo, completely changed the energy landscape globally overnight. And so Denmark, being heavily reliant on imported oil for their power, recognized that they needed to create a new energy technology in order to replace the oil that they were no longer getting. And thus Vestas, and one of the largest wind companies now in existence, was born, and the world moved, or part of the world moved, to a new energy paradigm. And so what we recognized is that everywhere in the world, people have different myths, they have different stories. And in Calgary, our myth was very much around how we were going to be stuck on oil forever, in spite of the fact that we knew that eventually it was going to come to an end. And the thing is, with peak oil, it's a really funny argument, because people will tell you, oh, it's never going to happen because we've got directional drilling and multi-dimensional fracking and all of these crazy technologies that will essentially make oil and gas last forever. And actually, anybody that says that is lying, because they don't really understand the concept of the law of conservation of mass, essentially. But the thing is, it doesn't matter if oil and gas comes to an end in 200 years or if it comes to an end in 30 years. The fact is that it will eventually come to an end. We depend on an enormous amount of energy globally. And so trying to work towards switching that energy supply over sooner rather than later is probably a good idea. And Denmark was well on their way. In fact, when we were back there studying at this institute, they were already at 20% renewable energy fraction on their grid. And we were actually working on a project to help move the grid, or pilot a new system that was going to allow us to move, or allow Denmark to move the grid to a much higher percentage of renewable energy. So we started realizing that there are a lot of myths out there, and there's a lot of people out there who claim that things can or can't be done. And while we were working on these energy systems, what we recognized was that the world will actually move to a renewable energy infrastructure sooner than we might think. And in fact, 10 years later, I think you guys will all agree that we're moving there quite rapidly with solar photovoltaics and decentralized batteries and all that stuff. So back then, when we looked at it, we said, the real energy supply that's causing probably the most destruction, which has actually ended up being true, is agriculture. And in fact, agriculture has released more GHGs into the atmosphere than all of the hydrocarbons burned combined, according to Dr. Ratan Lal from Stanford University. In fact, it's by a factor of 2. So agriculture has released more carbon into the atmosphere than all of fossil fuels by a factor of 2. So we left Denmark and we realized that we needed to learn about this permaculture thing, which is this huge white elephant. And if you're just new into permaculture right now, you'll probably agree that it's very hard to wrap your head around what this behemoth actually is. And I'm going to get into that partially tonight and also over the next series of sessions. So we traveled through Mexico, we traveled to Egypt, we traveled to different parts of the Middle East. We traveled all through Europe, we traveled through parts of the US and most of Canada. And what we found were all of these unique farming methodologies, all these different ways of looking at growing food, ways of growing food that wasn't necessarily destructive. And we started to see the same myths all over again. In fact, the myth that you guys are probably all aware of right now is this myth that you've probably never put words to, but you've all thought about in one form or another. And the myth is that humans are inherently destructive. Okay, you see this myth in Facebook, you see it on YouTube, you see it in the newspaper, on the television. These are conversations that are happening that are very negative and very destructive. And they're part of that same mythology that we witnessed early on when we were talking to other engineers in Calgary about whether or not we could turn over to a renewable energy infrastructure. And so through this introduction to permaculture, through my own journey in permaculture, what I recognized is that humans are not inherently destructive. And in fact, if the most negative thing on the earth is the nuclear bomb, why aren't we asking ourselves what the most positive thing is? And that was the real outcome out of all of this. We also learned how to design permaculture systems. We learned how to change our life. We completely reinvented our careers. We became ecologists, engineers, and permaculture designers. But the most fundamental thing that I think that we got out of all of that traveling and over the last decade is that we can be just as positive as we are negative. So I don't just want to say that and give lip service to it. I want to talk about specifically how to do it. And then at the end of this course, we're going to go through some case studies. So the book that I'm going to be following throughout the course is going to be Bill Mollison's Introduction to Permaculture. And every once in a while, you'll see a page number show up in one of the margins of the slides. And if you have the book, you're welcome to follow along. This is a fantastic book, probably one of the best books Bill wrote on the subject. He also wrote the design manual, which is a huge, huge book. And it's one that I don't recommend people get into right away. This is actually a far more tangible, easy to access book on the basic study of permaculture. Now, while we're looking at this picture, one thing I want to say about this book that gets a lot of criticism is that people say, well, you know, Bill wrote this for the subtropics. There's lots of examples in here about the subtropics and the tropics. And the thing is that that's actually irrelevant. It doesn't actually matter that this book was written for the subtropics or the tropics, because you can distill down the patterns that exist in the tropics. And so there are patterns that are universal, or patterns and principles that are universal all across the world. And so if you can distill it down to those patterns and principles, then you can figure out how to apply that pattern or principle in your specific bioregion, which might just mean that you use a slightly different technique. You see, one of the things that we are stuck on as a species, and I'll say this a little differently, one of the things that we're stuck on as a society in the 21st century is that we all want to be given techniques. We want to know how to do things, how to hold a shovel, how to use a pair of pruners, how to, do any number of things. We want people to walk us through step by step. But this is not a very resilient way of learning, because if you just copy other people's techniques, you may miss some of the context that was involved in the development of that technique or the evolution of that technique. And how you dig a hole in Jordan, for example, might be completely different than how you dig a hole in Canada or the United States. And so the overarching principle might be that you need to dig a depression in order to harvest water. How you do that in the different countries is going to be different. And so we always have to think in terms of principles and patterns, because they're far more universal. And if you read this book with those ideas in mind, you're going to get a completely different experience than if you read it trying to go after technique. And I'll caution you as well, when you're going on YouTube and you're looking at how people do things within the permaculture space, be cautious about just copying technique. That's the same thing as looking at a book and copying technique there. Try and always come back to that base principle, that universal constant that makes sense. So how you harvest water in Australia is different than how you harvest water in Canada. But the point is that you need to harvest water. So try to stay out of the technique if that makes sense. So why live on YouTube? This is a great question. And actually, I'm going to come back to this image a little bit later in the course, not tonight, but in one of the future sessions. This is actually my homestead, my urban homestead in Calgary. And it's got all the stuff that we're doing on it. So I'll go through all of those in detail at a later date there. But I wanted to talk a little bit about why I chose to go and teach an Introduction to Permaculture course on YouTube instead of just live here in Calgary. So number one, there's lots of people all over the world that are on our mailing list that have asked us or created or shown us interest for an Introduction to Permaculture, and we've never been able to fulfill it. And now with the way that technology is going in YouTube, I thought that that was a great opportunity. Number two, when I was thinking about what it was like for me when I first learned about this permaculture thing, when I first got that Jeff Lawton video about greening the desert and how hard it was to find any information on permaculture. There's a Wikipedia article, there's a couple YouTube videos, but nothing really high level, nothing really at that principle-based approach that I was just talking about that I could really grab into. And so it was basically jump in with 2 feet or get out sort of thing. And so luckily I jumped in with 2 feet. I actually took my first permaculture design course in Orcas Island with the Bullock brothers, amazing course. I took another course with Jeff Lawton in Australia when I was working with him. And then we hosted another course in the early days by another incredible teacher, Jesse Lemieux, who was amazing. And so we really did jump in with all feet right from the beginning. But I recognize that because it's such a big subject and it's a big initial investment to get into this stuff, I wanted to create something that would provide people with a forum to ask questions and get a little bit of an insight with regards to what this permaculture thing actually is, to see if it's a fit for them and if it's something that they could apply to their life to help increase their resilience, or perhaps to create a new career like we did and transition out of what they're currently doing into something a little bit more aligned with their passions or their dreams or their aspirations. And so I thought, what better place to convey this information than on a forum like YouTube? And so here we are. So what I did is I took my Introduction to Permaculture course and I've broken it up into 8 one-hour sessions of content, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A, which we'll get to a little bit later tonight. And so just to give you an idea of what we're going to cover over the next 8 weeks from a content perspective, tonight we're going to talk about philosophy. Next week, next Wednesday, we're going to talk about integration and design and water as a master element. Number 3, we're going to talk about waste as an opportunity and site water analysis. Number 4, we're going to talk about rainwater tanks and systems as well as urban and rural swales. Now, there's a lot of confusion about where swales should and shouldn't be used and whether they're good or whether they're bad. We're going to demystify that all for you guys. And I found my first spelling mistakes there. That should say curb cuts. It says cur cuts, wicking beds, and constructed wetlands. Number 6, we're going to talk about water in the garden and other design methods. Number 7, we're going to talk about energy efficient site planning. Number 8, we're going to talk about sector, slope, and flow in design and how it really kind of makes the whole design come together at the end there. Now, after we get through all of the content, another thing that's lacking within the permaculture space that I hope to help fill a little bit of the gap anyways is a few sessions of case studies. So these are going to be specific examples of properties that we've worked on. Some of them are our own, some of them are for our clients. We do a combination of consulting and education. And so we're going to talk about our urban permaculture homestead. We're going to talk about a 5-acre grid hybrid homestead. So it's got all sorts of neat bells and whistles in it. We're going to talk about geosolar heating and cooling systems. So this is not biological at all, but it uses all the same principles of permaculture combined with some engineering in order to help heat a house using free and available solar energy. So we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about another urban permaculture homestead. And then lastly, I'll talk about another 5-acre off-grid homestead that's not too far from our house that we've worked on over the last 4 years. So after learning about all of the content, we're going to help to concrete this back down with some real tangible examples of how we can use permaculture within what we do. That's one of my favorite quotes of all time. It's by one of the great permaculture teachers, Larry Santoyo. He's got this saying that you don't do permaculture, you use it within what you do. And that's one of the big confusion pieces that people constantly get stuck with is people say, well, you can't run a profitable permaculture farm or you can't run a profitable permaculture business. You don't have to run a permaculture business. You can run an engineering business and use permaculture within your engineering business, or you can run a farm and incorporate certain aspects of permaculture into the way that you design that farm. It's like lean manufacturing. You don't do lean manufacturing, you use lean manufacturing within what you do. And so permaculture is kind of similar. It's a design system. So today we're going to talk about what is permaculture. We're going to talk about the Prime Directive of permaculture. We're going to talk about ethics and principles of permaculture. We're going to talk about both the industrial system, and then we're going to contrast it with the ecological system. And then I'm going to give you guys an example comparing immature versus mature ecosystems and how they differ so that you can start to look at the world with a slightly different set of lenses. So what is permaculture? I'm just going to ask you guys, what do you think permaculture is? I'm going to just keep an eye on the comment section here, and you guys can just pipe up and let me know what you think permaculture is. Just put it into the comment section. Okay, so Street Machine says promoting a biodiverse soil food web. Yep, that's definitely one of them. Yep. Feel free to just put your thoughts on what permaculture actually is. And if there's a bit of a delay in the video or there's a blank spot, it's because there is a delay in the video between my live cast and what's going on YouTube there. Eco-friendly, working with natural processes to reduce inefficiencies and maximize resilience. Chris Bullock. Great. Okay. Feel free to keep putting up your own definitions of permaculture up in the chat window, and I'll check them from time to time. Before I get into my definition of permaculture, I want to talk about this quote that Bill Mollison left us before in one of his books, and it's actually in the design manual. And he calls it a Mollisonian principle. And basically, it's an incredible, there's an incredible amount of knowledge built into these two words, everything gardens. And believe it or not, I heard this right at the beginning of my permaculture foray, but I had no idea what it meant. It sounded like everything could be solved with gardens, which is exactly one of the things that it means. It means that Jeff Lawton has a way of saying this, all the world's problems can be solved in the garden, which I think is completely true. But there's actually a deeper meaning to it as well. And the deeper meaning is, I'm hinting at it here with this aphid and ant, which is on my screen. Now, aphids and ants have a really interesting relationship with each other. If you've never watched aphid and ants work together, I highly recommend it. One of the things that happens when aphids and ants end up on your trees or on your shrubs is you inevitably, most people will inevitably go out and try and kill them without actually fundamentally trying to understand what's going on. You see, the aphids are actually farming, the ants are actually farming the aphids. The aphids are actually responding to a specific condition on the plant. The plant is not healthy. And so the aphids are taking advantage of that lack of health in the plant. And then they're extracting phloem from the leaves and turning it into honeydew, which the ants then use, bring back down to their nests in order to breed more ants. And so you could say that the ants are actually gardening. Now we can go through all sorts of different examples within our ecosystem. So beavers actually farm the forest. So they garden the forest. They actually cut trees down. They create a 100-year flood every year with their dam. And then in doing so, they raise the groundwater table and new species and biodiversity emerge. And so if you look at some of Glenys Hood's work from the University of Alberta, she talks about how when a beaver comes into an ecosystem, its destruction or its actions will actually increase the amount of biodiversity in that space. Another one is woodpeckers. So up here in Canada, we had the pine beetle epidemic, which basically took out all of our pine forests in British Columbia. Well, it turns out that one of the reasons that happened was that we planted monocultures of pine. Another reason is that woodpeckers actually farm pine beetles because they eat them. So they would actually dig them out of the bark of the pine trees, and they would move them from tree to tree to actually farm the pine beetles. And so we can find examples of this all over the place of animals that are actually manipulating their ecosystem. And so that's the root cause of what this thing actually means, is that almost every species does whatever it can do in order to manipulate the ecosystem around it in order to meet its needs. Now, what's really interesting is this is a great opportunity to bring up the word disturbance. Now, if you think about the word disturbance, disturbance itself kind of has a negative connotation. Like if you really think about it, if I was just to say the word disturbance to you, the first thing that you're probably going to think about is probably not a good thing to create disturbance on something, right? Well, ecologists don't think about the word disturbance as bad or good. It just is. It's just an action. It's like Newton said, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And so humans themselves actually create disturbance. I think we can all agree upon that. And I think one of the primary reasons that this myth exists around the fact that humans are intrinsically destructive is that we look at the disturbance that humans actually create. And most of the examples that we see are of destruction, desertification, deforestation, oil sands, you name it. I mean, anything that we do, we seem to touch, we create entropy, we create swaths of death, essentially, in a lot of ways. And that's just a small subset of humans. There's actually a lot of humans out there that are doing the opposite, but we don't hear about them very much because we have a cognitive bias towards news that is negative. So your first piece of advice for me tonight, if you get anything out of this course at all, is to stop watching conventional media. It does no good to you. And all it does is convince you that the world is just bad all over the place and there's no good. So you need to start being selective about the media channels that you engage in. And preferentially, we want to try and look for optimistic ones and positive ones, because negativity tends to skew our prefrontal cortex into thinking that things might be worse than they are. And generally speaking, when we get into the negative kind of form of thinking, we shut down the thinking portion of our brain and we're unable to come up with solutions. So permaculture itself is a design system based in positivism, and we're always looking for opportunities to turn the problem into the solution. So you don't have a turkey problem. You don't have a grasshopper problem, you have a turkey deficiency. You don't have a slug problem, you have a duck opportunity. You don't have a rainwater problem, you have a water harvesting opportunity. So we're always trying to turn those problems into opportunities. So my point with talking about this disturbance is that, and this is something that eco-minded individuals really struggle to get their head around, and then once they finally get it, their whole world changes, is that the only thing you have control over is your disturbance. You can't stop having disturbance. It doesn't matter. It's unless you turn into a ghost, and probably even if ghosts exist, they probably even have a disturbance too. But you basically, we live in a physical world, and you can't not have a disturbance. I think I used two double negatives there. So no matter what you do, you're going to leave a footprint behind you. The difference between leaving a footprint behind you that's negative, let me say that again. So the difference is that on one hand, you can leave a negative footprint behind you, or on the other hand, you can optimize your disturbance and leave a positive one. So like I said just a few minutes ago, if the most negative thing is the nuclear bomb, what is the most positive? So the idea behind permaculture is not to be less bad, which is essentially, if you listen to all the climate change rhetoric right now, like it's pretty negative, right? It's pretty bad. If I had to summarize it down into one statement, it would be less bad, and at best, we're completely hooped. We have no chance as a species. Like, we're done. It's over. And I really can't buy into that conversation, because the conversation is lacking in a lot of opportunities and solutions that clearly are not PR worthy. And so in this course, what we're going to talk about are all those solutions that individuals can make right outside of their back door by just looking at how you create your own disturbance patterns and what you're going to do with every single one of those 600,000 hours of life energy. And if you design your life right and you use that energy correctly, you'll be amazed at the abundance that you can create around yourself. And I'm talking about real abundance, like food, food forestry, livestock, renewable energy systems, low energy buildings. I mean, it's not hard. This stuff is all pretty simple. We've been doing it for a long time. It's just that there hasn't really been a system like permaculture that's brought it all together. And so this is why I think permaculture is more relevant than ever, is that it's the only system that I've come across that looks at shelter, water, waste, energy, food, community, and says, these things are all really good by themselves, but the really important thing is what happens when we start to look at them as a whole unit. And that's when the magic starts happening. So here's a little saying that you can write down. Permaculture is not the roof, the rain barrel, or the solar panel, but the connections between those elements that matter. Okay, it's the connections. And permaculture gives us the tools in order to be able to create those connections efficiently and effectively as well. And so from this point forth, I will talk about the problems, but I'm always going to preface them with solutions, because it's the solutions that we need to talk about. You know, the best analogy that I've thought about with regards to this stuff is that if you're a canoeer, if you like to paddle and you're going down a white water river, as a paddler, if you look to where the rocks are, that's where your boat's going to go. Okay, so if the rocks are the problems, then we have to stop. We have to acknowledge that the rock is there. We need to know where it is in the river, but we need to, more importantly, we need to plot our course around the rocks. Okay, and so the analogy there is that we need to think about the solutions more than we need to think about the problems. We need to acknowledge the problems, accept them, and then work towards the solutions. All right, let's move on. Okay, so the next big chunk of philosophy within permaculture, which I really resonated with, was this idea of the Prime Directive. Okay, and so the Prime Directive is, number one, to take responsibility for our own existence and that of our children. And number two, we need to get our house and garden in order so that they feed and shelter us. So the reason that this really resonated with me was that it's really easy to be in the ecosphere and constantly feel guilt, constantly feel like other people are judging you for what you're doing or what you're not doing. And this completely eliminates it. Number one, it eliminates my desire to pass guilt on to anybody else, because it's none of my business what anybody else around me is doing, because chances are there's always something more that I can do to make my situation better, or to optimize my own disturbance pattern, or to improve how I'm currently living within the earth. And so who am I to judge somebody else for their diet, or what they have done or have not done to their lawn, or how they are wasting energy, because chances are I'm still not perfect myself. So I'm going to just forget that. And then number two is this idea that our house and gardens should feed us and shelter us. And I think this is so poignant. I mean, if you look at most North American homes, our houses need to be paid with mortgage payments. We've got to pay taxes to them. We constantly feed them with energy. We have to constantly maintain them. If you've got, conventional landscaping around the house itself, you've got to constantly mow it or add fertilizer or water it. I mean, it's constantly consuming. And what's crazy about most North Americans is we spend all of our time away from our home. So we work, so that we can come home and work. And then once we're done working at home, then we go to sleep, then we wake back up again and we go back and leave the house and work again. And this is just pure insanity. And so if we're going to actually spend 500,000 hours on a mortgage, which, by the way, if you break the word mortgage down, mortgage is actually a French word. And if you break those two words up, mort, M-O-R-T, means death, and gage means pledge. So it's a death pledge. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't get a mortgage, and I'm not saying you shouldn't get a house. But what I'm saying is that if you're going to sign a death pledge for the house that you're going to live in, shouldn't you buy a house that is going to shelter you, that's going to keep you warm, that's going to minimize the amount of energy that it's going to consume, because that's money out of your pocket that you're paying with after-tax dollars, by the way? Shouldn't you be turning the yard, which is just basically just a giant biological solar panel, into something that's going to produce calories for you, so you're not having to go and buy it from the store? And by the way, those calories could probably be more healthy for you than anything you can buy in the store, so they're actually improving your health. And by working on your garden, it's actually going to give you vitamin D. It's going to get you to know your neighbors. And so we need to build infrastructure around us by making the right decisions in a way that buttresses our existence, as opposed to constantly taking away from it. And this is the thing that blows me away, is how many people are willing to sign these death pledges in order to buy these houses that they are completely enslaved to, as opposed to just taking a step back and saying, how can we change this situation? How can we design a system that is actually going to take the money and energy that I'm putting into it and give back to me? And I've got some great examples of people that have turned their houses into not just a place to live, not just a place to grow food, but actually a place to make a livelihood as well. My friend Curtis Stone and I were just filming a video for a new passive solar greenhouse course. And his passive solar greenhouse, which is about 1,000 square feet, can generate anywhere from $50,000 to $300,000 a year just in microgreens. So our homes can actually be business centers as well. And I'm not talking about something that's taking away from you, a business that's actually adding to you, that allows you to go and fulfill your passion. But we just have to get the design right. And we're going to talk about the nitty-gritty of what that means when we get into the depth of this course. So stop blaming anybody else for your problems and start looking inwards and trying to understand what it is that you can do in your own life. And you'll be amazed at how much you can actually do in a really short period of time. So let's look at this mind map for a few seconds. And on this mind map, it's going to basically talk about what we're going to cover in this course. So we're going to go through some ethics. That's next. Care of earth, care of people, and fair share. We're going to talk about the concept of integration, okay? And this part of the course completely changed my engineering degree. This is the piece that I never learned in engineering that should have been on the first day of engineering school. I had to go take a permaculture design course to go and rethink about my entire engineering degree. So there's tons and tons of value in here. And I'm going to make sure that you have all sorts of aha moments around how to bring integration into the way that you design your systems. Within there, we've got relative location, so needs and yields analysis. Each element performs many functions. Each important function is supported by many others. We're going to talk about energy efficient planning. Okay, that's the next principle. So capture and storing energy. So zone analysis, sector analysis, slope analysis. We're going to talk about using biological resources. And we're going to talk about energy cycling and the importance of thinking about that in the context of your property. A lot of these words are going to be a little bit jargony at this point, but by the end of the course, I promise you'll understand what they all mean. Next, we're going to talk about small scale intensive systems, and we're going to talk about how to accelerate succession within your ecosystem and what that means in the overall context within your property, but also humanity as well. We'll get kind of right up there at that 30,000 foot level again. I really like this quote. The greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it. And I think this is really what I was feeling when I left or decided to leave my career, was that I wanted to make sure that I at least was doing something that I had a passion for with those 600,000 hours we spoke about. But number two, I wanted to make sure that I was not contributing to status quo. Again, I couldn't really criticize the oil and gas industry because I drove a car and I heated my house with natural gas and I required, vegetables from California and Mexico. And so how could I criticize the very industry that I was supporting as a consumer? And so that's when I recognized this paradox that I actually had to just go and figure it out. And I did. And I'm encouraging you guys to go inwards and figure out what that means for you. It's probably going to be different than what it meant for me. But it's amazing how many people come to our programs saying the exact same thing, that their current job or occupation or what they're spending their time doing is just not fulfilling them. And they feel like there's another way or a better way. So I want to ask you guys a question. And some of you may have heard this question before. I think it comes from William McDonough in his book, Cradle to Cradle. But the question is that if I went to you guys on YouTube and I said, I got to reframe that. I totally screwed up that comment. If one of you guys came to me on YouTube and you asked me in the comment section, hey, Rob, how's your marriage doing these days? And I said, oh, it's pretty sustainable. You'd probably feel pretty sorry for me. Who wants to live in a sustainable marriage? And so the question on this slide is, should we aim to sustain our systems or should we aim to regenerate them? And obviously the choice is regeneration. We want to live in a system that is getting better with time. Now, down the road, we may move to a paradigm of sustainability, but I think you would agree with me if we looked at the Fertile Crescent and various agricultural regimes or areas around the world where we've basically turned them into deserts. We don't want to sustain deserts. We don't want to sustain dead creeks and dead rivers. We don't want to sustain dead lakes. We don't want to sustain dead zones in the ocean. We actually need to move towards regeneration. And what I've been amazed at since leaving my oil and gas job is that people are ready to pay for this stuff. People want to regenerate ecosystems. I'm not saying everybody wants this, but there is a significant demand for people to go in and actually regenerate ecosystems. Now, that can come through regenerative farming. It can come through the design of resilient homes, acreages, and farms, which is what we do. It can come through individuals wanting to change their relationship to the land that they own, whether it's a small urban property, an acreage, or a farm. People are moving in this direction because they recognize, or some of them are starting to recognize, that we depend on the ecological services that our ecosystems provide to us. So a regenerative system, a system that has been designed to regenerate, is going to provide net positive calories. This is really important. Most people don't realize this, but every calorie in the industrial food system takes 10 to 12 calories of hydrocarbons to produce. So that's in the planting, fertilization, tillage, herbicides and pesticides, harvesting, shipping to market, processing, packaging, shipping, buying at the grocery store, bringing it home, cooking it, and eating. Now, if we were all coyotes and we had to put out 12 calories of energy or even 10 calories of energy for every calorie of food that we consume, we'd all starve to death. So that represents one of the largest fragilities that I can see in present day society, is that if oil and gas does start to become scarce, we're all going to starve to death because we're not actually eating food, we're eating energy. Now, what's nuts is that when you get into a productive, permaculture-based food production system that's designed properly from the ground up, we can easily get 2, 3, 4 calories for every calorie invested, and maybe even more than that, depending on how the system is designed. The point is that our systems can actually produce net positive calories. Right now, they're definitely in the red. We want our systems to produce topsoil. I just read an insane statistic from Dr. Christine Jones, who has an amazing website. And if somebody can find it and place it into the comment section, I'd be really appreciative. It's Amazing Carbon. If you just Google Amazing Carbon, you'll find it. Dr. Christine Jones. And she has an article up there that talks about how every ton of grain that's produced right now conventionally erodes 7 metric tons of topsoil. I'll just let that sit with you for a second. 1 ton of grain, 7 tons of topsoil. Not a good trade. The topsoil on our planet is the most important ecosystem on the entire planet. It's the most biodiverse ecosystem on the entire planet. And there's this myth that exists that it takes 1,000 years to grow an inch of topsoil, and this is just not true. We can grow as much topsoil as we want if we get the design of systems properly. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of this presentation. We want our systems to increase in fertility and diversity. So every year, the more fertility is on the property. Every year, more diversity is on the property. Have you ever wondered why there's not little garden gnomes running around the forest, spreading fertilizer, pesticides, and herbicides, and yet forests that aren't touched by humans do really, really well? How is it that that's possible? There's got to be some wisdom in how that system is designed in terms of how it's managing its fertility and diversity. We want our systems to improve water quality so that water coming into the system is leaving cleaner than it came in. We want our systems to reduce pollution, to absorb CO2, to bring pollution into the system. And pollution is just an unused resource. So we want to find opportunities to turn waste products into new resources. We want to create habitat for other creatures because other creatures are going to do a lot of the work for us. So if you've got a grasshopper problem, you might have a turkey deficiency, but you also might have a songbird deficiency. So instead of bringing in turkeys, you can just bring in habitat for songbirds to deal with your grasshopper problem. They'll be very happy to deal with it for zero cost. We want to cycle nutrients. This is one of the biggest issues that 21st century humanity has right now, is what to do with our excreta. Right now, when you buy a carrot from California and you ship it up to Canada, you're not shipping a carrot, you're actually shipping NPK and water, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in water. Then when I eat that Californian carrot and I go to the washroom and I flush it down the drain, those nutrients are gone forever. So there's a broken nutrient cycle there. It's really, really important. One of the most shocking one of the most shocking statistics that people don't realize is that the inefficiency of the cow represents the efficiency of the land. So if a cow consumes 100 pounds of grass and 100 liters of water, 90% of that's going to end up back on the property. Now, that's only a problem in a feedlot. But if that cow is in the right design of an ecosystem, then those nutrients and that urine, that manure is going to end up back on the system, and it actually compounds and makes the system function better. Okay, so this is an example of where the disturbance of the cow in the right scale, place, time is going to improve the ecosystem overall, as opposed to take away from it. And that's the difference between a carrot and a cow. I'm not saying carrots are bad. I'm saying that if you grow a carrot, ideally you're going to grow a carrot where you eat it, and that you'll find a way to return those nutrients back to where it came from in an ideal situation. Whereas if you eat a cow, most of what you're eating in that cow has been, as that cow ate, was left behind on the farm. Okay, so that nutrient cycle is a very important conversation to be having in order to talk about sustainability. Now, the thing that I don't want to create conflation or confusion around is that doesn't mean that every ecosystem on the planet should have cows. Remember, this is a technique versus principle perspective. The principle is cycling nutrients. How nutrient cycles in a jungle or a tropical forest is different than how it cycles on a prairie. But both systems still cycle nutrients. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. And lastly, our systems should build community. So we should have systems that are actively building resilience around ourselves. We need to work very hard at this now because we have these things like social media, YouTube, Facebook, and it gives us a false sense of community. We actually need to go out to our neighbors and start lending flour again, or borrowing an egg, or creating a local community group. We need to be engaging face-to-face with other human beings. That's where resilience ultimately comes from. And there's lots of different ways and modalities to do that. So a colleague of mine, Owen Hablitzel from in the States, who is a holistic management expert, as well as a grazing expert and a keyline expert, also teaches permaculture as well, did this project. And I just love it because you can't get much more contrast than this. And so on the left-hand side, you've got a burned out cotton farm, which If you know anything about cotton, cotton is one of the most destructive crops on the planet. Because it's not edible, there's no real limits to how much pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers get placed onto these fields. And so in a very short period of time, through all those chemicals, through irrigation, you end up with a glaying of the surface, which basically stops any water infiltration going deep down into the subsoils. And so once you get that seal on the surface, the system basically crashes and it can't sustain itself anymore. And so Owen came in using a disturbance methodology called keyline plowing, and he broke the compaction layer just below the subsurface using a non-inversion keyline plow. You can Google that. If you Google keyline plow and then go to the images section in Google, you'll come up with a plow. It's a chisel type non-inversion plow. This is a technique, okay? The principle is harvesting water, getting water into those deep systems. And 1 year later, without any seed, this is what he ended up with. So this is my point. We have so much power. We have so much potential. All we have to do is get the principles and patterns right and look at our place on the earth a little bit different. Now, this is the interesting thing, is that if you actually believe that humans are inherently destructive, then you're basically saying that humans are not of this earth. Every living thing on this planet has a niche. It has a role to fulfill. And the question that I want to ask you tonight is, what is the role of humans? And when you start recognizing that there is no bad and there is no good, there's just how you are going to use your life energy, how you're going to use the disturbance that you have access to. What you realize is that there's no scarcity at all. It's all abundance. It just requires a slight shift of paradigm. We just have to look at the world through a slightly different set of lenses. And all of a sudden, all of that negativity and depression, which I'm not saying you guys all have, but a lot of people that come through our programs are really scared. They're really sad. They're really depressed about the state of the world because they don't realize that there's another way. So what if every time I started to invent something, I asked, how would nature solve this? Okay, and so permaculture is a design system inspired by nature to the design of sustainable human habitat. So we go out into nature and we figure out how they do it. How do beavers harvest water? How do woodpeckers farm grubs? How do gophers create passive heating and ventilation systems so that they naturally get ventilation through all of their tunnels just by placing the inlet and the outlet in the right location and creating a natural venturi? Nature has all the answers. Janine Benyus, who wrote this quote, is a famous author who wrote a book called Biomimicry, and it's an incredible concept, which Bill really tried to capture in the 1970s in his designer's manual when he started talking about pattern. So how do we go into ecosystems, look for patterns, and then bring them back out into the way that we do things? Because nature has been running for 4.8 billion years, has had an unlimited budget for research and development, and I suspect she's got it figured out. And all we have to do is have the humility to go into nature on a regular basis and start asking very simple questions that we can then use that information from those questions and bring them back into the way that we design everything. So let's talk a little bit about the industrial system. And then we'll partner it with the ecological system. And then we're getting really close to the end of the presentation this evening. So this is the system that we find ourselves in right now. And so pretty much everything comes from oil. A lot of stuff, not everything, but a lot of things come from oil. Oil is a very keystone element within our industrial ecosystem. We then upgrade it into things like industrial agriculture. And so that then gets wrapped in more oil in the form of packaging. And then whatever we don't use goes to landfill. And so we call this a linear system. Okay, so the problem with linear systems, or the characteristics, I should say, of linear systems is that they're very efficient. They're really good at moving energy from one system all the way through as quickly as possible. They're very scalable, so you can scale them up very quickly. These systems are also based on specialization. So everywhere along the system, you've got people that are highly specialized in driving combines, or specialized in buying stuff, consumers, or specialized in extracting resources, the oil industry, or mining, or specialized in driving bulldozers in the landfill. So our whole society is based around specialization. Linear systems are also very fragile, because if you take any one of these things out of the system, the whole thing collapses. Okay, and so that's just a general property of linear systems. They're only as strong as their weakest link. Now, this is a negative thing, but it's also a positive thing, because chances are most of us are consumers. So if you're a consumer, you have a considerable amount of power to change the system. You just have to change your relationship with the system. So instead of being a consumer, you should be a producer. They're black swan prone. So I haven't talked much about black swans, but black swans are a concept that an author named Nassim Nicholas Taleb came up with. And essentially, they're hyper rare extreme events. So things like Fukushima was a black swan. The fires in California recently were a black swan. The floods in Calgary in 2013 were a black swan. The 50 million person power outage in the eastern United States was a black swan. So these are really large events that change the course of history. And certain systems are more prone to these types of events than others. And linear systems are very, very prone to black swans, because they're linear and they require every single one of these components within the system to function. So not one we really want to design our systems around. Ecological systems, on the other hand, are based in networks. And networks are very, very resilient. Okay, so these systems generally can resist the fast changes that linear systems cannot. In fact, if you look at a fishing net as an analogy, if you cut 60% of the threads within a fishing net, it will still catch fish. So basically what happens in a web is all of our energy comes from the sun, which if the sun stops shining anytime soon, we're all done. So there's no point contemplating that. And then within the system, the ecosystem itself tries to cycle nutrients back and forth as quickly as possible, with a very small percentage of the energy that it can't cycle being left to go back down to the ocean. Now, there are actually ways that nature has figured out how to get those nutrients that are stuck in the ocean back up onto land. One is glaciations that happen over many thousands of years, but another one is something as simple as a salmon run. And so a salmon run is essentially just a phosphorus pump, if you will. So every time the salmon swim up the river, yes, they are living animals that are trying to fulfill their destiny, but from an ecosystem function perspective, they are basically just driving nutrients that has ended up in the sink back up onto land, so that land can continue to cycle those nutrients. Remember, we were talking about nutrient cycles. So at the bottom, I've got a few different pictures, which I think helps to drive this message home. So on the left-hand side, we've got the internet. The internet is a highly connected web. It's fairly resilient. I'm sure that it could be more resilient, but it is fundamentally based on network theory. It's non-linear. The next one over, the blue picture, is actually mycelium. One of the largest organisms on the planet is in Oregon, and I think it spans over 21 square kilometers. I think it's a pine mushroom. And this is fundamentally the internet of the soil. If you haven't heard of Paul Stamets, I highly recommend checking him out. If somebody could do me a favor and just Google Paul Stamets TED Talk and put it into the comments section, I'd really appreciate that. The next one is kind of a strange one, but I think it helps people to understand what it is that we're doing when we design a permaculture system. So if you think of your property, whether it's a farm or household, as a pinball machine, and the pinballs as energy coming in, whether it's water, nitrogen, phosphorus, human labor, livestock or livestock labor, manure, grass clippings, leaves coming off of a tree. Our job as designers is we're basically the pinball player. So we get to set the pinball game up, and we get to put all the bumpers in and all that stuff. And we have the traps and we have the sinks and things where we lose the balls. But then we actually have to press the buttons really fast by setting up the right systems in the right places so that the ball stays in play as long as possible. Okay, so that's our job. We're trying to keep energy and flow as long as possible. We're trying to set up our properties, our lives, our businesses even, in the same way, with the same goals of a pinball machine, trying to keep that ball in play as long as we possibly can. The next picture to the right is actually a picture of the human brain. And I showed this because it is fundamentally a web. And I think you guys can all agree that it's a web of neurons. Now, our body takes about 90 watts of energy, which is pretty amazing that we can actually do all the stuff that we do for a little bit less than a 100-watt incandescent light bulb. And what's really interesting is that I don't approach oil and gas or fossil fuels or any of the non-renewable resources with any kind of disdain or anger or frustration. I think it's our job to use our brains, which runs on 90 watts of energy or a little bit less than that, to essentially design fossil fuel out of this system. So we should be using fossil fuel for things that are enduring, that will last for long periods of time. Rain tanks, houses, roads, sidewalks, food forests, ponds, swales, water harvesting infrastructure, greenhouses, all of these things that require energy inputs, but will last for very long periods of time and will always, if they're designed properly, give more energy back than they took in the first place. Okay, so this is the last slide, I believe, of the evening, and I think that it's super poignant. So if you just pay close attention here, I'll take you through it. There's a bunch of information on this one slide. So the first thing that I want you to see, I'll just bring my mouse over here, is that I'm going to compare an immature ecosystem to a mature ecosystem, okay? And notice that both ecosystems have the same amount of solar energy. That's what this top line represents. They're both getting the same amount of sun. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about immature ecosystems and some of the characteristics of them. So they're low in diversity. They're based in annual plants. They're based in competition. They're based in parasitism. They're based in nutrient leakage. I'll go through all these in a second here. Export, fast change, and water export by drainage. So let's go through this. And we'll use a wheat field as an example. So a wheat field has low diversity. It has one species of wheat over a very large area. A wheat field is based in annual plants. Okay, all the plants only live for one season. They don't keep coming back. The fundamental system of growing wheat is based in competition. So we actually, as humans, compete against the resources by spraying herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, whatever side we decide it needs, in order to compete or get rid of the competition so that the single crop is the only thing growing. The next thing is it's based in parasitism, and you could go in both directions. We're parasitizing the ecosystem. We're forcing it to grow one crop over massive areas. And I just want to state that you can grow wheat sustainably. You don't have to grow it in this way. There are very productive ways of growing wheat that don't lose soil and that build soil actually, but it's based on something a little bit different, which we'll get to in a bit. Nutrient leakage. So these systems, like I said, 1 ton of grain grown conventionally loses 7 tons of soil, not to mention all the other nutrients. Most of the fertilizers sprayed on these fields don't actually go into the plants. They get run off. And I mean, that's not a controversial thing to say. We have dead zones all over the planet right now in our oceans. And those dead zones are a result of trying to grow annual crops and spraying them with water-soluble fertilizers. Fast change. So you have a hailstorm come through. Well, there goes your wheat field. Or you don't get slightly enough rainwater, no wheat field. Or you get too much rainwater, no wheat field. They're very, very fragile. They use high amounts of resources. I mean, this comes back to what we were saying earlier. Every calorie of food we eat takes 10 calories of hydrocarbon. And overall, they are degenerative, okay? Generally, as these systems degrade, the water that hits them doesn't even go into the soil anymore because the soil loses its carbon and its ability to infiltrate water. Now, let's compare that to an ecosystem, like a mature ecosystem. And by the way, I do not differentiate a rainforest from a native prairie. Even though their scales are different, the architecture is the same. A functional native prairie has many, many tens, if not hundreds of different species within it. And those species are fulfilling similar functions that you would find in a fully functioned, matured rainforest. And so we find the same pattern at different scales all over the earth of these mature ecosystems. We just have to go out and seek them. So mature ecosystems are high in diversity. So there's lots of different types of plants. They are based in perennial, but also in annual plants, but primarily perennial plants. They are based in cooperation. And so the plants themselves actually connect up using mycelium and will actually support each other. They're based in nutrient circulation. So they actually cycle nutrients amongst each other. So some plants are nitrogen fixers, some plants need nitrogen. And so they figure out a way of exchanging with each other, typically nitrogen and sugar and various other materials that they can exchange with each other in order to make a stronger system. So cooperation. Their consumption is on site, so they meet their needs from the resources that they've got. They're not constantly bringing new resources in. They have slow change, and they have water export by evaporation as opposed to drainage. All right, and so these systems are resilient, they have low resource use, and they're regenerative. So my question to you is, which one do you want to design your system around? And the answer is pretty obvious. It's the mature ecosystem. Yet most of humanity focuses on the construction of these immature ecosystems. So permaculture is aiming to meet human needs within the concept of cooperation with mature ecosystems. Okay, we cannot live without our ecosystems. We cannot live without our forests and our native prairies, and we cannot live without our animals. We need to figure out how to live with them, in a way that we become part of that community, as opposed to constantly trying to be the only one at the table, trying to control it with all of our knowledge and power. There are ways that we can build systems that are mutually beneficial and cooperative. So the last thing I want to say is a quote that Toby Hemingway said, which is that if you wanted to define permaculture in the most simplest form, you would say this: if present day society is aimed around one simple thing, which is how do we meet human needs, then permaculture as a new paradigm, a new design system, a new way of looking at how to live in harmony with nature would be how do we meet human needs while enhancing ecosystemic health? Okay, and it's not one or the other. You can have your cake and eat it too, and I'm going to show you how. So in summary, today we talked about what permaculture is. We talked about the Prime Directive, so why it's important to look inwards and figure out what you can do, as opposed to spending any of your energy focusing on what other people, politicians, businesses are not doing. Just focus on what you have the power to actually change in your own life. The next thing we talked about was ethics of permaculture. And after that, we talked about the industrial system, the ecological system, and the immature versus mature ecosystems. Okay, and so this concludes the first section of the introduction to permaculture. Next week, on Wednesday, 6 o'clock Mountain Standard Time, we're going to talk about integration in design. Now, this integration component was what completely changed my engineering degree, and I know you're going to get tons and tons of value out of it. I'm going to attempt, and I've never done this before, to run a workshop on YouTube on how to actually create this concept of integration within your own system. I'm going to try and teach you the tool that I use most often in my design work. We're going to follow it up with live Q&A after the workshop. So I'm going to let you guys ask some questions. And then we're going to finish with water as a primary element in design. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how water fits into the whole equation and how important it is, and why we really have to give it a lot of attention in order to be successful. So where to get more information? So I will put some show notes at the bottom of this presentation. So I encourage you to check that. This will be on YouTube afterwards, probably sometime tomorrow. And so check the show notes. I have a ton of free resources at vergepermaculture.ca. So if you join our mailing list, we have a blog book. I've been writing blogs for a decade. I've got so much free information in this blog book. It's totally free. You can sign up for it. If you check the show notes below this video tomorrow, you'll find our free blog book. We have free e-courses. I have a free e-course called the Permaculture Primer. It's a 4-hour video. We've also got Adaptive Habitat, how to design your own resilient home, acreage, and farm. They're free right now. I'm not sure how much longer they're going to be free for, but you can sign up for those. Those will be in the show notes as well. We also have passive solar greenhouse case studies. So I've gone around to 5 different greenhouses. There's more of these coming very shortly. around North America, and I've collected case studies on different passive solar greenhouses, because that's one of the things that I also teach. So I encourage you to check those out. Those are also free right now. They may not be free forever. So if you want to sign up and take a look at those will be in the show notes. We offer permaculture design trainings. So if you're interested in taking a PDC and you're somewhere in our neck of the woods up here in Calgary or Invermere or Edmonton, generally Western Canada, check us out at vergepermaculture.ca. And I'd be happy to talk to you about what our permaculture design courses entail. We have online training. So I'm going to have a select mentorship program starting in the spring called the Permaculture Pro webinar series, where I'll have a small group of people that can come in and basically just ask questions for an hour and a half on anything they want related to permaculture to help them progress their projects. So that'll be in the show notes tomorrow as well. You can also check that on our website. And we also offer consulting. Depending on where you are, we have phone consulting, but we'll also do live consulting as well. We'll come to your site. You can check us out at adaptivehabitat.ca. That will also be in the show notes as well. So how to support this course? I would love it if you guys hit the like button. That would mean a ton to me. It will definitely help the course track. And I love it when I see likes. So if you can do that, that'd be great. I love it when stuff gets shared on social media. So this video will be live tomorrow on YouTube. Please share it through your social media. If you felt that there was value in here and that other people will benefit from it, I'd really appreciate that. Make sure you leave comments below. You guys have been leaving tons and tons of comments. I've been really appreciative of it. It's been hard for me to take a look at it as I've been presenting, but I'll have a look at them. I'll look at all of them, I promise. And then if you found this valuable, in the show notes tomorrow, there'll be a small donation button. If you feel like donating, I'd love it. If that's not possible for you right now, that's great. You can help. Your donation can just be sharing it on social media or hitting the like button or leaving your comments below. I loved presenting to you guys tonight. I'm really excited about this new format. I'm going to be back here next Wednesday at 6 o'clock. Tell all of your friends. Let's see if we can get this to 1,000. I've got some time right now. I'm just going to take a look at my watch. It's 7:11, so I've got 25 minutes to answer questions. So I'm going to let you guys pose them up onto the comment section there, and I will answer them as they come in. So I'm just going to unshare my screen. Okay. So lots and lots of great comments here. Thank you guys so much for all of your kind words. If you have any questions, feel free to put them up and I will get to them as they come in. I'm here for another 25 minutes. You're welcome, Anne. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. Okay, first question. How cold is too cold for a year-round greenhouse production? So, Mark, there's not really a too cold. It just comes down to design. I mean, it gets really tough when we get into the north. But every ecosystem is going to have a greenhouse that is appropriate for what it is that you're trying to do. Most of my clients don't realize that if you've actually got a heated house and it is really cold in the middle of winter and it's tough to keep your greenhouse warm, let's say you live in the Arctic, but even in Calgary, Alberta, for example, it gets down to minus 25, sometimes down to minus 30 Celsius. So it's approaching that common temperature gradient between Fahrenheit and Celsius. Microgreens. I mean, everybody should have microgreens in their house. Microgreens are worth about $15 a flat, 15 to 20 bucks a flat. And so that's money that's not out of your pocket. It'll help to humidify your house in the middle of winter, and they're really, really easy to use. However, I'm a really big fan of movable hoop houses if you're trying to do 2 or 3 season production. And then if you really want to go all year round, you can do some pretty interesting stuff with passive solar greenhouses. I encourage you to check out the free passive solar greenhouse case studies that I'll put in the show notes tomorrow. Next question. Any suggestions on how you started to implement the principles of permaculture for yourself initially? How did you start out after you had studied? That's a really great question, JM. So the first thing that we did was we made sure that we were spending less than we were making in the oil and gas industry. So we had savings. And we did all sorts of things to try and save our money. So Michelle and I house sat for almost a year. So we lived in other people's houses while they were traveling to try and conserve our resources. Michelle actually went back to the oil and gas industry, and she continued to work while I started to work on the business. And so the first thing that I did was I hosted a permaculture instructor that had been doing it for a little bit longer than I had. And it was good for him. It was good for me. I got to learn. He got paid and got a new network as well. And out of that, I started to get confident. I then remember teaching my first introduction to permaculture course to an organization here in Calgary called Green Calgary, amazing organization. And I taught for an hour and a half to 2 hours a week over a period of, I think it was 6 weeks. And so the same thing I'm doing on YouTube, I actually did live when I first got started in permaculture. And it was a huge success. Out of that course, we ended up running some permablitzes. The permablitzes were basically volunteer action. So we would go in and turn an entire yard into a garden and food forest in a day. People paid me to do that. And then volunteers got to contribute for free. So they got some hands-on experience. They got to know me. They got to know the concept of permaculture. And it just kind of grew organically to the point now where we have students right across Western Canada, some of whom still run permablitzes to this day. We've got multiple teachers in multiple parts of Canada right now, and even parts in the US. And it just grows. And so the quote that always sticks with me about this idea is that you'll overestimate what you can do in a year and you'll underestimate what you'll do in 5. Little Brother 82, I watched your video about the geodesic greenhouse. How did the beeswax switches work to open and close the doors? Okay, great question. And I think you left a comment on our website as well. So basically, and I don't have one with me right now, but you know what? I can bring it up online and then share my screen. So Opti vent. So the vent that Little Brother 82 is talking about looks like, let's see if I can find one. Good picture of one. There we go. All right, so this OptiVent opener is basically a wax cylinder, okay, and it has a piston in it, which looks like, here's another picture of one. So there's the wax cylinder and there's the piston. Let's see if I can find another good image. There's another one. Okay, so there's the wax cylinder and there's the piston, and this is the operator. So what happens when this cylinder warms up, because there's beeswax in there, it actually pushes, the beeswax expands and it pushes this cylinder out, and in doing so, it actually opens up the vent. Now, if a thunderstorm comes along or a cold wind, this cylinder will actually cool down, the beeswax contracts, and then it pulls the window shut, all without electricity. Okay. About time for a good beer, I say. Yes, I agree. It's definitely beer o'clock. Okay, Frankie Robertson. See if I can. Frankie Robertson. Blue dot. Sorry, guys, I just got lost in the Northern Homestead. We grow cucumbers right now just north of Calgary, but not in a greenhouse indoors. Move the garden indoor. Yep, I totally agree. If you guys want to check out a really great website, check out Northern Homestead. These guys are such nice people. I really like them. They've got some great blogs. Just going to plug them because I really like them. I'm going to be featuring their greenhouse if they let me next year, hopefully, or this year, sorry. So check them out. They're a really great couple doing some really cool work. Dustin Hall, embrace every day. If I may share one definition I've heard, it's an ethical design system that can be used to create a permanent human culture. Thanks, Dustin. Appreciate that. Totally right. Blue Dot, you mentioned focusing on positive news. Can you recommend some sites? Well, I'll tell you what, vergepermaculture.ca has got lots of positive news all the time. I'm always talking about solutions. So you can focus in on what it is that we're doing. Anything related to permaculture, generally, you're going to see pretty positive stuff. Jeff Lawton's site, permaculturenews.org, is really great. And generally, just turn the news off. Don't listen to it. It doesn't really add to your life. I spend a lot of time listening to audiobooks. So when I feel like I need a hit of information, instead of going to the media, I go to Audible instead. And there's lots of different audiobook options out there. I'm just going to ping you guys again, remind you, I'd love it if you guys hit the like button if you found this useful. It's really helpful. It's just on the bottom of the video there. If you found this really good, please hit the like and feel free to share with anybody that you know. Sawwood, the tough nut to crack seems to be high, cold desert. Will you have some insights into working in this type of area? For sure. Sawwood, if you have any specific questions about what you're struggling with in the high, cold desert, by all means, shoot those questions my way, and I'd love to try and answer them. Okay. Sarah Blazy Chuck, I think. I grow microgreens all winter. I think that was meant to be a W, all winter. That's awesome. Yeah, they're super easy to grow. Durdust, any advice for getting your first client for a permaculture design? Durdust, if you've taken a PDC and you've been working to try and build up your permaculture design business, run a permablitz. Go and offer a free installation. Find a client that is willing to let you experiment on their property. Free clients are the worst clients to have, basically clients that don't pay you because they don't really take you seriously, but you got to start somewhere. And then see if you can't get their community of individuals, their group of people to come out and help do an installation. If they won't do it, then get your own community together to help you install it and teach them while you're doing it. The guys in Melbourne created a Permablitz document, which basically details out how to host a Permablitz and how to be a host for a Permablitz. The idea is that if you start a Permablitz network, that as the person receiving a Permablitz, you should have done 2 or 3 Permablitzes before you get it. But if you're just starting from nothing, you got to start somewhere. So chances are the first person to get one is not going to have gone to anyone. And then as you do these Permablitzes and you do really good work, hopefully, and you're a great teacher and you can teach other people how to install these systems for themselves, you'll inevitably get more clients. You'll get more students if you're teaching at the same time. And it just builds on itself. It happens very, very quickly. That was one of the most successful things that we did on the front end. And perhaps I'll make a video on how to start a Permablitz network in an upcoming YouTube video. All right, next question. Oh my gosh, I need those openers for my geodome. Yes, Shannon, so my recommendation is that you are very careful about which one you buy. Buy it bigger than you think you need it, because the ratings for how much weight they will push are a little bit overstated, I've found. So get the biggest one you can find and it should work. Little Brother 82, thanks a bunch, such a cool idea. Falling Leaves, passive solar greenhouse. Years ago, I was able to see a great greenhouse that a retired postmaster had built attached to his house in Ainsworth, Nebraska. Yes, I think I know exactly who you're speaking with or about. I've got his stuff. I think it's called Citrus in the Snow, and you can actually get his design package online if you look him up. I think I know exactly what you're talking about. Frankie Robertson, cool. Falling Leaves, passive solar greenhouse. Continued the greenhouse, was 4 feet underground. He had buried most of the north side. I'm not sure what you're saying there, Falling Leaves. Northern Homestead, thanks. And yes, for sure. Okay, well, we'll be looking you guys up. Let's see here. What's the next question? Frankie Robertson, audiobooks, falling leaves. Greenhouse, one end of each pipe came up along the south wall and the other ends came up all together in a box inside a greenhouse. A simple house fan ran to blow the air through the pipe. And I believe he was using a heat pump as well, falling leaves. Rocky Terrell, nice to see you guys on the show. Where do I source mushroom spores and how do they do in our Alberta winter? Should it be a summer harvest? So Rocky, I recommend you check out two companies. Man, I can't remember their names. Kruger Family Fungi is one of them. And there's another one as well, and I cannot remember their name. If it comes to me, though, I will put it up on there. There are certain species that you can use. One of the things with mushrooms in our ecosystem is that it's a little bit cold for, it's a little bit dry. And so you have to have a really wet year in order for the fungi to really thrive. However, you can inoculate your swale trails, which we'll talk about in a future intro course in a couple of weeks from now, with things like wine cap or other aggressive mushrooms that will live in that mulch. Falling leaves, greenhouse. Anyway, greenhouse staying warm enough in the winter to grow tropical plants without any additional heat. So I think that was 3 comments there, falling leaf. Yeah, I know exactly the person you're talking about. Ann Wilson, I'm very ill and can't do much physically, but I can definitely start with microgreens, even just for myself. That's fantastic, Ann. Thanks for sharing. Frankie Robertson, LOL. Sean Croxton's quote of the day show is a great for a daily dose of positivity. Okay, great. Noah's Gardens, greenhouse in the snow. Yep. Falling leaves, no heat pump when I was there. Field and Forest Products, Noah's Garden says. Daryl Cox, Paul Stamets, Fungi Perfecti, another great site. Permaculture Homestead. Can't have permaculture without the Permaculture Homestead. Absolutely. If you are looking for a great YouTube channel, definitely check out Permaculture Homestead. I'll even find it for you guys and put it up there right now. There we go. Okay, next comment. What do you search for to find those beeswax cylinders? Can't find it anywhere. That's a good question. So greenhouse vent operators, I think. Let me see if that comes up. Yeah, type in automatic greenhouse vent openers. Flags 237. Hi, Rob. We were at the Bullocks together in 08. Tell me who you are. I can't recognize Flags 237. Love to know. That was a fantastic course. Changed my life. Shannon Shirk. So up here we get to -40 to -50 for weeks. Will passive solar greenhouse still be able to work without costing a fortune in heating it? Well, Shannon, it depends on what your goals are. If you shut it down for the weeks that you're going to get to -40 or -50, then it's not really an issue. And so you might just have a 3-season greenhouse. If you answer me this, does your ecosystem stay pretty sunny in the wintertime? Like what latitude are you at? Coralie B, thank you again, Rob. I need to go, but look forward to the next week. Take care. Thanks so much for showing up. Make sure you hit the like button if you take off. Falling Leaves, Noah's Garden. Yep, that was it. As I'm in South Dakota, was really inspiring by that. Little Brother, is Sepp Holzer's book worthwhile? You know, I haven't read his book, but I've got 3 or 4 people around me that have, and they say it's awesome. So if you read it and you find it's really good, I'd love to know what you think. Tim Engebrecht, can you talk about the climate battery annualized geosolar using the thermal mass or a below grade wicking beds? Absolutely, Tim. So essentially what happens with a geosolar heat system, or annualized geosolar or geothermal, is you're taking hot air from above in the hot part of a building, and then you're pumping it underground, and you're extracting the heat and hopefully the humidity out of the system, and you're storing it in the ground. Generally speaking, I've seen quite a few of them. I've even designed one, and they work. What I can't tell you at this point, I'm working on it though, excuse me, is what the coefficient of performance is. So I don't know, for example, how much energy they consume and how much energy they actually store and then release, and whether you'd be better off to use the energy in the fan to add heat into the space, or whether you are better off to use the annualized geosolar. That's going to take me a little bit more time to sort out. So I think they're worthwhile experiments, but I can't give you a guarantee that they're actually going to be a net positive asset. I think there's a lot of opportunity for innovation in this space, especially for somebody that wants to actually measure the effectiveness of the system. And in engineering, we call this a coefficient of performance. Is pumping warm air under the floor effective for a thermal sink? I seem to think using water would do a better job. Little brother 82, yeah, I hear what you're saying, and everybody always goes to water. But here's the thing: the minute I use air, I don't have glycol. I don't have to worry about freeze thaw considerations. It just gets a lot simpler. The infrastructure is less expensive. And so that's why generally people have moved to air systems as opposed to water systems. So I would recommend fully checking out the air systems before you go down the path of putting in a hydronic heat storage system underneath a greenhouse or building. What's the best way to spread permaculture in a suburban neighborhood or schools? You know, it's really interesting. One of our students, a couple of our students actually, run a company called Regenerate Design, and they're having a lot of success with this. So I think there's an opportunity to actually come in and teach small permaculture programs. Teachers are always looking for unique speakers. So if you're into permaculture, this would be a great thing. You can actually make a living doing that. And then I think that there's opportunities to actually put in food forests for kids. There's a lot of nature education that's starting to show up in schools. And so if you can create a curriculum that solves some of the problems for teachers, I think there is an opportunity to get some inroads there. It might take a bit of grinding in order to do it, but I think it's a worthwhile investment. My kids spent the first 3 years of their school life in nature kindergarten or forest school, and they're very permaculture oriented. So there are definitely some schools that are going to be more interested than others. Thank you. Akesi Farms for Mushrooms. Thank you. That was the one that I was looking for. Amanda Tolan. I'm going to put the link in there. Okay. Awesome, guys. Well, we're getting to the end of the evening. Like I said, we've got another session next week. If you haven't hit the like button, I'd really appreciate it if you did. I'm going to bring this live cast to an end in a couple of minutes here. If you have one last question, I can answer one more. If not, then I hope you guys have a wonderful evening. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Bring your friends and family out. Let's see if we can get this course to 500 people. That would be incredible. And thank you so much for showing up. And we will see you guys all in a week's time from now. Hey, Jordan, nice to see you. Little brother asked one last question, and then this is going to be the last one. Is there a way to calculate how many hours of daily sunlight is needed to know whether a greenhouse is feasible on an urban property? Yes, there is. And I don't have it here. It's called a solar pathfinder. This tool will help you to calculate how much sun you've got. Okay, and last question. I have a passive solar kiln for drying lumber primarily, and last week it was 50 C when the outside temperature was -22, 70 degrees Celsius temperature differential. So I'm assuming, Tim, you're saying that you've got something that collects passive solar energy, it's heating a kiln, and there was a 70-degree temperature differential. That's incredible. So thank you for sharing that. Tim, I'd love to see the design of this passive solar wood kiln. That'd be really cool. Okay, guys, thank you so much. Make sure you check the video tomorrow. I'll have all the show notes in below. Hit the like button if you haven't done it, and we'll see you guys all next week on Wednesday. Last thing, if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, you can do that, and you'll get notifications. If you're not on our email list and you want reminders about the course, you can sign up on our webpage, and all of that information will be in our show notes. Thanks so much, everyone.